It's Thursday, August 2nd, 2018. This is the Hermetic Hour. I'm your host, Poke Runyon, and tonight we present a discussion on the alleged parallel world or transdimensional ariel Queendom of the Sylphs known as Magonia. That was documented in medieval histories and has recently inspired a fantasy novel of that title, Magonia, by Maria Headley, 2015, and was the main theme for the UFO authority Jacques Vallee's Passport to Magonia, 1969 and 1993, which dealt with the Magonian close encounters from the 9th century and other supernatural visitations recounted in European folklore as early examples of alien sightings, close encounters, and abductions, on through to the mysterious airship reports from the American West in the 1890s, comparing them with modern reports and investigations. As Jacques Vallee contends, and as Hermetic devotees, we certainly concur with him, that most of these events are interdimensional rather than extraterrestrial, that there are parallel worlds coexisting with us as near to us as our furniture. Now, this is also the main theme of our film, Beyond Lemuria, 2007, reissued in 2014, and, as I mentioned last week, is set forth in the old Hermetic book Comte de Gabelais, which was first published in 1760. So, if you'd like to spend an hour in the absolute elsewhere, stay with us, and we'll take you down the rabbit hole. Well, let's begin by my review on Amazon of Maria Headley's Magonia. Now, this is a science fiction novel that reads like a work of literature. It is so good that I had to force myself to read it. And I've always been a pulp fiction reader and writer. And I grew up on Edgar Rice Burroughs, and so when it comes to adventure fantasy, stories set on other worlds, I have little patience with catharsis exposition and introspective character development. Start with a bang and end with a boom. But in this case, the slow, painful beginning is necessary. The author has carefully plotted her story based on medieval reports of contact with the Magonian sky people, our Hermetic Sylphs, and fairy folklore. The protagonist, Asa Ray, is a Magonian, switched at birth with a human baby. As a high-altitude creature, she suffers through human childhood with chronic respiratory problems. She is not expected to live past 16. So the first 2 chapters were uncomfortable reading, especially for me. I had asthma when I was a kid. But it was necessary to give Asa's eventual return to the sky world a physical, emotional reality that most fiction of this genre fails to achieve. Well, another notable example of this is Philip K. Dick's Valis, where we have to suffer through the protagonist's madness to appreciate his vision. Maria Headley decides to avoid interdimensional special effects and opts for the old-fashioned fairyland rationale. You know, some people can see fairies, and fairies can be seen by others, but only if the fairies want them to see them. You know, like the old Irishman said when they asked him, Can we see the fairies? And he said, well, you can see them if they want you to. And the Magonians in Headley's book have a symbiotic and transformational relationship with birds. Their serving class, the Roasteray, are avian shapeshifters who can become birds at lower altitudes. Now, each Magonian has a heart bird that nests inside the chest. in the lung and sings magical songs with the host. Now, Asa has a heart bird called the Milkit. Asa has a special destiny and a mission, and this is why she was swapped out as a baby. Her songs can save Magonia and perhaps destroy the surface world in the process. Now, the Magonian ships hide in the clouds, and they follow the storm clouds over farmland to pick up the earthly crops scattered by the storm. Now, the French back in the 9th century even passed laws against them. And I don't want to give away too much of the plot, but this crop raiding is a major issue in the story. The Magonians are hungry, and they control the storms with airborne whales, what they call squall whales, sort of an organic harp system. And I wonder how the squall whales stay aloft. Now, I solved this problem in my Skyworld novel, Drillmaster, by having both plants and animals in my imaginary world. And the animals included giant squids, which I call drills, and they produce buoyant gases. Now, the plants made buoyant seed pods, and the drills and other aerial animals produced buoyant gas organically in their systems, and they had fly bladders, like a fish's swim bladder. Now, I'm going to deviate from my review a little bit here and discuss some of Maria Headley's solutions to propelling her airships and lack of solutions for keeping them aloft, and compare it to things I did in Drillmaster. But see, how do you propel an airship, especially if we're talking about they first appeared in the 9th century, way back in Charlemagne's time, and they were described as sailing ships in the sky. Well, the way Maria Headley does it is she has aerial creatures. Magonia is filled with these aerial creatures, owls, eagles, and all these different kinds of birds that are, some of them are very, obviously very intelligent. They're the Asterae. They're the shapeshifters. They can, when they go down to Earth, they change into big eagles and big owls and whatever. But then when they're up in the Magonian stratosphere, they're kind of humanoid with wings. They sort of look like that they look like that little owl in TripAdvisor, that you see on in the television commercials. But the way Aza's ship, the big ship, is propelled, they have a giant bat, and this bat. And he's really not enslaved. He's a sentient being, but he propels the ship with his bat wings. He's a huge bat, with a 100-foot wingspan, and he's harnessed to the mast, and they call him the bat sail. And the bat sail, you can even talk to the bat sail, and these. So Magonia is peopled by these hybrid creatures that are part animal and part bird and part bat and whatever. And the Magonians themselves, of course, are adapted to high altitude life, like the same as my Varkas and Drillmaster. They're adapted to high altitude living. And of course, poor Asa, who was Magonian, switched with a human baby. She almost dies as she's growing up. In fact, they don't expect her to live past 16 because she has these terrible respiratory problems, and her lungs aren't in the right place, and her physiology is completely different. But the other thing that Maria does not deal with in this construction of hers is she doesn't do anything with any kind of lift capability, like buoyant, as I say, like buoyant gas. And I wrestled with these problems when I created my sky world. I wrestled with these problems. And fortunately, I was working for a technical company at the time, and I had some engineers, some engineer buddies, and they kind of helped me. They helped me design sailing airships and how do we keep these things aloft? Well, I conceived of some seed pods that were filled with this buoyant gas, and the seed pod would come up from the roots of the tree. And I had these big cedar trees were like banyan trees with root systems that went all over the ground, and then the seed pods would come up through the earth, and then they'd float up and float away, and then eventually burst and seed more trees. Well, the way I got my sky islands up was that I figured that some of these seed pods would get caught under the root system and lift the whole tree up. And it would lift the whole tree up, and these trees would go all the way up into the clouds, and then they would link together and gradually form sky islands. And that's the way I solved that problem. And as far as the airships are concerned, well, we take these same zero globes and put them on wing decks on the airships, and then what I would do is that if you wanted to gain altitude, you exposed your zero globes and your wing decks to the sun, and they heat up the zero globes, and you'd go aloft. And if you wanted to descend, you cover your zero globes on the wing deck with tarpaulins and then soak them down, and that would shrink the zero globes, and you'd go down. And then we had a great big wind, like a Dutch windmill propeller, and I had one of my engineering buddies figure out how to get this thing going with a flywheel, and then we had galley slaves up there on the decks, with a great big capstan, going round and round and round with this gigantic propeller. Yeah, and then we used regular sails, below decks and above, and so the sailing airships were quite a project for us, but Maria doesn't do that in Magonia. She in fact she even has a floating city, but she never describes how it stays up. And of course, I mentioned later on here, I'm talking about Flash Gordon. Remember, in Flash Gordon, we had the Voltown that had the city of the Hawkmen, and they kept the city of the Hawkmen up with atomic rays that kept them up, and naturally they had a black gang of slaves shoveling radium into the furnaces in the Sky City to keep it up there. But so this is one of the weaknesses. As I said, I can't figure out how she keeps her squall whales up aloft. So this is one of the things but she has a sequel. She has a sequel called Airy coming out. It's already out, and maybe she's dealt with some of these problems, but she does suggest that maybe the Magonians originally had farms of air plants. And of course, immediately there's all about, gosh, are air plants edible? Yeah, we found out that there are some air plants that are edible. There are air potatoes. They're about the size of little tomatoes, but they're supposed to be very good. So they could have had the Magonians could have had air plant farms, but then somehow or other their air plant farms either got destroyed or depleted. And then they did. Then at that point, they started their storm magic using their squall whales and started their storms, and then sweeping down and gleaning or gathering up the scattered harvest after the storms. And of course, that got them in trouble. And And as I said, the medieval French even passed laws against them. And so this Magonia, especially the old 9th century French accounts, and then actually there were later accounts, in the Irish annals of Ulster. This kept going on all the way through the Middle Ages. There in the 11th century, there were Magonian incidents. In fact, in one case in Ireland, they came over and hooked a church steeple with one of their anchors, and the parishioners cut the anchor cable, and supposedly the Magonian sky anchor was stuck in the church steeple for several hundred years. I don't know whether it's still there or not, but this story was authenticated by a number of people, and there were several other incidents of this. But as I said, I have a lot of questions, and maybe the sequel, I'll get some answers to them, of what kind of solutions that she's come up with on how to keep things elevated. And because, for one thing, that she does not do is, as I say, any special effects, and that includes interdimensional doorways. There's no Bermuda Triangle, there's no wormhole, or there's no going through, like going through a Stargate or anything like that. They're in the Magonians in her book they're using that kind of fairy magic. In other words, if you're one of the people that can see them, then you'll see them. And if they want you to see them, yeah, you'll see them, but otherwise you won't see them. And they hide in the clouds. And I mentioned here is that unfortunately most of the plants in the Voynich manuscript, they seem to have root systems. But then, that I was hoping that the Voynich manuscript was suggesting that it might be written in Magonian. But it could be, but most of the plants that are shown in there seem to have root systems, so they don't look like air plants. And so we're going to need something like the Bermuda Triangle to navigate between worlds. And I said, oh, well, Oz was made invisible by magic, and I suppose Maria Headley can do the same thing with Magonia. And now, Ozza has an earthly boyfriend, a super genius kid named Jason, who believes that she's dead when she makes her ascent. But she returns to him, and we are assured that we will see more. They will see more of each other in the sequel. And I await her Harry with bated breath. And there's a kind of a pun in there because the breath are human beings that work for the Magonians, and one of them is Oz's sister who she got swapped out for, and these are captured human beings that work as agents, surface agents for the Magonians. And they have to, when they're up there in Magonia, they have to wear breathing apparatus, of course, because they're too high altitude. That's the essence of my review, and you can read that on Amazon. And by the way, you can also buy Drillmaster on Amazon. And Drillmaster by Poke Runyon, and I'd appreciate it if you would, because we really would like to get sales on Drillmaster up, and frankly, I had some help from the master Lynn Carter in building my world. In fact, I've even got an article by Lynn Carter, or a letter by Lynn Carter, on how to build worlds, how to build imaginary worlds in Drillmaster. That's worth the whole price of the whole book. This is by Lynn Carter, and it eventually became his book, Imaginary Worlds. He expanded that letter into a whole book, which I imagine Maria Headley has probably read Imaginary Worlds and how to build an imaginary world. And that's in that original letter that eventually became that book is in Drillmaster and Drillmaster. So let's So let's go on Amazon and order Grill Master and get Magonia too, and compare my sky world to hers. I'd appreciate that. So anyway, as I said in the review, Ms. Headley has appointed special effects, dimensional portals, wormholes, stargates, and other quantum physics parallel world gimmicks, such as our intergraviton in Beyond Lemuria. That was our interdimensional film. Now, and she made her Magonia invisible by magic, the same way that L. Frank Baum did with Oz after the Wright brothers opened the air age back in the early 1900s. Now, Headley's approach is similar to Richard Shaver's presentation of his inhabited cave world of the 1940s and 50s, Amazing Stories. Physically impossible in our dimension, but nonetheless real. Now, unlike Shaver's caves, she doesn't claim her Magonia is really up there, but she does try to make it convincing. Curiously enough, both Shaver and Headley both seem to be recasting folklore, fairy tales, and hermetic elemental personifications as forms and venues of separate reality. Actually, they are not alone in this. In the first half of the 20th century, our popular pulp fiction comic strips and movie serials exploited these themes and ideas to a remarkable degree. Dorothy Gale went to Oz. John Carter went to Mars. Flash Gordon went to Mongo and flew with the Hawkman, and he swam with the Sharkman, and eventually became the king of the cavern-dwelling magic men. These fairies or hermetic elementals, the sylphs of the air, the salamanders of the fire, the undines of the water, the mermaids, and the gnomes of the earth, all have their invisible realms. Magonia is certainly the realm of the sylphs, ruled by Queen Peralta. The other elemental realms have been given various names in folklore, but Magonia of the sylphs is the only one named in historical record. Now, the question we are asking in this broadcast is, how real is Magonia and the other elemental realms? The cavalier answer might be, well, how real do you want them to be? I had followed a family tradition and read the Oz books to my daughter from age 5 to 9 each evening before she went to sleep. One day she came to me with a very serious expression and said, "Daddy, I want to go to Oz. How do I get there?" Well, I thought about this before answering, and I decided that I would be as truthful as I could be, which is the best way to be with a child, and give her the only magic secret I knew that would get her there. I picked up an Oz book, and I handed it to her, and I said, "Learn to read this yourself, and it will take you there," I told her. Well, she took my advice and devoured all the Oz books, and by the time she had graduated from high school, she was writing her own science fiction and fantasy stories that were frankly better and more imaginative than what I had been writing at her age. Now, in reflecting on this, I'm convinced that the human imagination is the greatest creative power in the universe. It is the power of God and his angels. It is the blueprint of the future, the vision of what is to be and what is hidden from us in the other nows of the simultane, those dimensional layers or worlds of the multiverse that exist in the same spaces we share at differing levels of frequency and vibration. Is Magonia real? Is it really there in our sky? Well, let's read about the simultane from Secrets of the Cavern World by Richard S. Shaver. And this is from the booklet that you get when you order Beyond Lemuria second edition. You'll get Secrets of the Cavern World. And I'm going to read from this booklet because Richard Shaver was he came up with a theory that is quite frankly remarkable. Now, let's see. He privately believed in this mysterious cavern world that was actually in another dimension, or a parallel world. In order for you to appreciate the significance of this concept in Shaver's universe, a little background is necessary. In the 1940s, it was just barely possible to imagine that survivors of an ancient race of extraterrestrials might still be living in a vast underground cavern network as Richard Shaver had envisioned, especially if you were a young teenage science fiction fan like I was. However, even Raymond A. Palmer, Shaver's editor and co-conspirator in the Shaver mystery stories, tried to convince Shaver that his Darrows and Tarows of the caverns were astral spirits, not physical beings. In those days, the parallel worlds theory was only a literary device, and Palmer's idea of ghosts on the astral plane was derived from an occult Bible called Oasthi that postulated spirits of the dead, ghosts in the stratosphere. No wonder Shaver rejected Palmer's suggestion. In those days, accessing other dimensions or parallel worlds was either fantasy or insanity. Dick Shaver kept his history of mental illness secret and had an instinctive fear of admitting that his visions were in any way unreal. Even so, in his true cavern stories, entering the subterranean world is a dreamlike experience. See Mandark and the Dream Makers. And in the Mind Rovers, he penetrates into the brain worlds of others. And in Mirrors for a Queen, he uses an old book of black magic and a pentagram with mirrors at its points to reach another dimension. He firmly believed that all magic was based on the lost science of the elder gods. But that lost science was very magical. Shaver was much influenced by the fantasy fiction of Abraham Merritt and James Branch Cabell. He believed both writers were telling true stories. In the case of Merritt's Moon Pool and The Face in the Abyss, the secret underground worlds were in this dimension. But James Branch Cabell's dream worlds were obviously in another time and space. Shaver was an omnivorous reader of mythology and romance. He had no style of his own, but he imitated whatever style fit the story he was writing. Palmer told him to write the Shaver mystery stories for Amazing in the style of Edgar Rice Burroughs, and Shaver complied. Came to what I consider his best and most important work, The Tale of the Red Dwarf, and its two sequels. He wrote in a style mix of Merritt and Cabell. In Shaver's rambling forward to The Tale of the Red Dwarf, he reveals that he is finally going to tell us the truth and tell it as fiction. There are 3 Red Dwarf novelettes that constitute one complete fantasy novel, but they were published from 1947 to 1949 in 2 different magazines. The third part, called Ernest Cliff, fully reveals Shaver's interdimensional concept, which he calls the simultane. This is an endless succession of dimensional layers, or membranes, he calls nows. Now, this sounds like the strings and brains of quantum physics M theory, but now you got to remember, this was 1949. In the backstory, Lua and Aegon seek the lair of the witch Feronia at Ernest Cliff in their quest for magical secrets and treasures. As Lua puts it, I have read in a book that was not written on this world of other worlds like our own, separated from us only by a little slice of a thing called multi-time or space-time, or some other word meaning dimensions unknown, and it's called the simultane. That magic is the crossing and mingling of these worlds, planes of light, and the bringing of the knowledge of one into the other. And the way of this is known to the witch of Ernest Cliff. Feronia agrees to help them, But the price of her aid will be the rescue of her lost lover and her child trapped in the simultane. They ask why she has not done this herself, and she explains that someone must operate the machine to keep the gate or the interdimensional tube open for them to return. The tube seems like a wormhole. But there were no wormholes in 1949, and if the gate reminds you of TV's Stargate, well, that was 50 years later. So, along with the story by Richard S. Shaver, and I'm quoting directly from the Red Dwarf now. Days passed, and Aegon wore now a permanent look of fixed astonishment, for all the world he knew had turned into insubstantial veils of gauze beside the realities he saw daily. And this day they were ready, and Magonia showed them the door that was not a door, but a flickering dread nothingness that went in and in forever into the rock, or into space, or where one could not see for the blue flames that licked always upward across the tube of force. Hand in hand they walked into the tube and along it, and the flames burned at them, and the vibrant forces of it stung their feet. But something else from behind them exhilarated and protected them, and as they walked along, courageous and with high hearts, now through the walls they saw the naked anatomy of the simultane, and about it the immaterial, tenuous, whirling, lacy curtains of repeated nows, thin, separated only by time, as the leaves of a book unleafing in the wind. On one of these painted windows that are worlds like our own, but different, is where our quarry is trapped, Lua's voice was strong in Aegon's ear. Strong and brave, yet it wavered, and as from the very awe of the terrible repeated variance of the simultane, which mortal eyes never see. What would happen to us if the Witch of Erdis shut off the great machine that throws this flow of energy upon which we walk, asked Aegon. Staring hard at Lua's face, transparent now as tinted glass, a tall ghost of a life wavering beside him as a thin wine glass shivers from repeated ringing blows. Well, we would wink out like two lights the wind blew upon, this fearful tube of force with us, of course. Lua did not look at Aegon, but her eyes searched. Always the fearful complexities of the repeated planes of immaterial reality. Separated by the dark nothings, she felt were just as much something, but something beyond her eyes, search, or her mind's grasp. We must travel to the end of this, no matter what may happen to us. For that is how this Durga of hers planned it. And then he was to return without delay, but he did not return. And neither will we without him, Aegon. I could not bear her face to come back without her little son. Aegon fell to watching the endless shadow play of life and the cities and works and movements of the worlds that their strange, vibrant walkways seemed to drive through, as a spit through a fowl, or as a sword driven through the pages of a picture book, and each page was a world without end, to his eyes stretching beyond sight, tall towers, square and endlessly windowed, where little ships flew through the air and big ships plowed the oceans, and men lived and died. There on the immaterial transparence, that was to him but tinted glass or the film of soap bubbles. They passed through the walls of this world of speeding planes and smoking ships and clanking machines, and another world and another and another, and many another still, and each different and varied, yet monotonously the same in a weird repetition of shapes and size, and movement and meaning to his eyes. Far off they could feel Ferona's manipulating the terrible power that upheld them. Tubes about them seemed to lower, and their stomachs felt the rush downward. The time she set for us has passed, and she is trying to set us exactly down where she sat her man down and left him there. She has done exactly as she remembered it. And if she is right in her work, we will find some trace of him. And if not, we had better just stay where chance leaves us. And we could try and try again, Egan. If we return to the tube of force, she will know, and we'll repeat the calculations differently. Now it seems the tube lay open before them, and they walked out on the plane of the simultane, as Egan thought. But immediately they stepped upon the bare and awful rock of the ever-existent. It changed, and there was grass over soft earth, springy under their feet, and the frightening transparency of the inconsequential reality was gone. The simultane was gone from their eyes, hidden by the now reality of the world they had set their foot upon. Now, some of Shaver's ideas were inspired by H.G. Wells' Time Machine. Wells' Morlocks may also have been the model for his evil subterranean Darrows, but Shaver probably believed that Wells was seeing true in the present and placing his vision in the far future. There is enough that is original, remarkable, and even prophetic in Shaver's simultane to strongly suggest that this was his private entrance to the cavern world, and as true a glimpse into ultimate reality as we purblind mortals have yet been gifted with. In this regard, please watch and read the message that ancient Hermes Trismegistus delivers from the summit of Mount Shasta in our film Beyond Lemuria. And I will read that before we conclude the broadcast. In the film, we have also used Shaver's simultane concept, combined with modern quantum physics, to recreate a modern version of Ferona's elder mech in our intergraviton. You will notice that our machine creates a vortex, much like the one described above by Richard Shaver. Now, if you're interested in learning more about the Shaver mystery, we suggest that you order The Hidden World #3. That's The Hidden World #3. That's Mandark from Amazon, and I wrote the foreword to that one. Visit www.shavertron.com to check out our interview with the Shaver Authority, Richard Toronto, and order his excellent book, War over Lemuria. Let me mention a couple things about the simultane concept that I think need to be related. The particular now that we are in, that particular now, stretches all the way out to the farthest galaxy that we can see. That's part of our now. Now, it could also be, well, everything we're seeing out in the night sky could also be in other nows, and there could, we could be seeing, we could actually be seeing through a veil of nows. That's possible, but there's one thing that one fact that makes this whole thing far more understandable. We are now, our universe that we could see, and this includes what's all the way out there in space, is only a small portion, a small fraction of the matter of the whole universe, the whole or let's call it the multiverse. It's only a small fraction. If we took the entire mass of the universe as we know it to be, and divided it by the fraction of matter that we can detect in our own universe, then we have at least 11 different levels, 11 different nows of the simultane. Now this is quantum physics. I'm not making this up. This is the way things are. So this parallel worlds idea is not something that you can that you can't say, oh, that's ridiculous. No, it's not. It's very, very, very not only possible, it's probable. And in a way, it's kind of frightening. And, so as I said, the concept of the Hermetic elementals, at least Magonia is one of the levels, the Queendom of Peralta, which would be but the Kingdom of Gold, King of the Gnomes, was primarily the one that Shaver was dealing with, and And then, of course, he also dealt with the Queendom of Nixa, the queen of the Undines. Shaver had a number of stories about the mermen, and I'd like to, while we're mentioning that, I'd like to mention our good friend Bill Musteel and his elemental, in his books on the elementals, Sylphs and gnomes and salamanders, and his stories of the Undines. That's Bill Musteel and his books on elementals. And the interrelation of elementals to human beings, and according to Bill Musteel, he meets a number of human elementals, various sylphs and undines, and these are fascinating interrelation that Bill Musteel recounts between human beings and elementals, especially between people and undines. And this was originally dealt with in that Hermetic book that we referred to, the Comte to Jacques Vallee, which talks about the actual marriages between human beings and elementals. And so these parallel worlds have a history in history, and of course also have a history in folklore. Now, this Shaver was 1949, years before the parallel world concept was taken seriously by physicists such as Michio Kaku, who wrote Parallel Worlds and published in 2004. And yet there was a scientist back in the 1960s who took the parallel worlds theory seriously. I'm referring to the French astronomer and computer scientist Jacques Vallee in his 1969 book, Passport to Magonia. Now, Vallee amasses data of the so-called alien sightings, encounters, and abductions, starting with the Magonian incident in the 9th century France and up through the mystery airship sightings and encounters of the 1890s in the American West. And he concludes that the most probable explanation for these phenomena is that they are interdimensional. He also suggests, although not as directly as Shaver, that they do influence our affairs. And I would like to just briefly discuss the airship mystery, as that there was reported. Not only was this reported by Jacques Vallee, but it was also reported by Charles Fort. And those of you who have been fortunate enough to see that wonderful film from the Lovecraft Historical Society, Whisperer in the Darkness, you remember one of the most enjoyable things in there is the radio debate between the professor and Charles Fort about the lobster men from outer space in upstate Vermont, and this is really what I really want to recommend that film, because it's right along the line of what we're dealing with tonight. It's called Whisperer in the Darkness. It's a modern version of a 1930s horror film, beautifully done by these people, and I heartily recommend it. And one thing that we need to read, as I promised I would, in our film Beyond Lemuria. And by the way, you can get this what I'm about to read and what I just read, Shaver's article on the simultane. They're both in Beyond Lemuria second edition, and that is available from Amazon, just like Drill Master, along with Drill Master. They're both from Maelstrom Press, and I strongly recommend Beyond Lemuria second edition, because you get to see this vortex. It's just very much like Shaver's simultane. Now, in Beyond Lemuria, the final vision, Hermes Trismegistus, the great classical pagan philosopher, in the film portrayed by Maestro Lan Duquette, and he does a beautiful job, appears over the top of the mountain and delivers this revelation. You seek to understand why such mountains as this are sacred and holy. As the master Hermes Trismegistus, I taught you that man is a microcosm of the greater universe. As a student of our Hermetic Master Philos, you learned that you have all the planets of your solar system living within you, but you are closest to Mother Earth. She is the greatest planetary presence within your spiritual body. So when you climb a sacred mountain in a spiritual state of mind, you are ascending to the heights of your own planetary sphere. You become one with the earth as she reaches to the heavens. In Kabbalistic terms, you are aspiring to Keter Malkuth. If you wonder why we have myths and legends of mysterious temples that appear in sacred mountains and strange creatures that inhabit the caverns beneath them, then you might ask yourself, how far does this microcosmic universe within yourself extend? How many previous lifetimes have you lived on this planet? How many other lives in other dimensions are you living right now? We see an endless march of worlds going on and on beyond our conception, and yet it is only one dimension that we perceive. There is an invisible infinity of parallel and adjacent universes just outside of our limited perception, in which our counterparts, our shadows and reflections, live and die behind dark curtains that most can never part except in dreams. And this whole vast, interconnected multiverse belongs to each of us alone. We are the masters of our own personal cosmic infinity. Life imitates art, and art imitates life, and everything in creation is a metaphor. You carry heaven and hell in your own pocket. As above, so below. As within, so without. In our philosophy, these other dimensions are considered to be levels of reality. There are many sublevels and superlevels, but three essential realities include them all: your personal reality, your shared reality, and the ultimate reality. To resolve these three realities into one, you must find that still, silent center point within yourself, where the veiled light we call God resides. You will find God nowhere else. Uncover that light and let it shine forth from within you, for that light is the ultimate reality. It transforms your personal reality and it illuminates your shared reality. To the one who is illuminated, all others are reflections and aspects of himself. This is the one source of his compassion and the true measure of his morality. However, I must leave you with a warning. Wisdom and immortality are the treasures of enlightenment, but no one else can give you that which is yours to find within yourself. No one else can make the decisions for you. Good and evil are for you alone to define. In darkness you may find the light, or beyond the light you may discover darkness. For in truth, you can't have one without the other. The choice must always be yours. And that wisdom of Hermes, I think, is as I say, that's in a spiritual sense, that's worth the price of the whole video, which of course is entirely reasonable. It's only $9. And we didn't mention them. We didn't talk too much about the mystery airship, but that's the final, the final culmination in fairly modern times of the Magonian airships. Back in the 1880s, there were all these sightings from California on through to the Midwest and all, down the Mississippi and the Missouri, all the way down to Texas, of this airship, this dirigible. And it ranged in size from 60 feet long to hundreds of feet long, and it was really an airship that was far ahead of its time, and it was there were newspaper articles about it, and the airship crews were taking people for rides, and they were going over farms and asking farmers to let them, to fill up their milk pails, and they're stopping for repairs and various things. And these were reported. There were hundreds of reports and newspaper articles and all of the about this phenomenon. And eventually this vehicle crashed down in Texas, and the remains of it supposedly got pilfered, and nobody knows where they are now. But this was all very well documented in newspaper articles, and it sounds almost like a sort of a modern rerun of the Magonian thing, or a presage of the UFO encounters. But if you read the Wikipedia article on it, the mystery airships, they debunk it by saying, well, yeah, there really were some experimental craft like that were being made and all that. But to tell you the truth, I suspect that all these reports of the experimental craft that were being from all the way from 1863, I'm not sure that those experimental craft, or actually, if they existed, I'm not sure if they existed. And this contiguous slice of the simultaneous, they might have been in somebody else's. The debunking sounds much like the development of the so-called Vril Society flying saucers back in Germany in the 1920s and 30s, all of which seem very well documented with photos and blueprints. We have to ask ourselves, did the Vril project occur in the now of our continuity or somewhere else in the simultaneous? Now, we wonder, this brings up the question, is there an Area 51 in Magonia? And of course, what we've been discussing tonight brings up a number of questions. Remember, I said that only a small portion of the physical matter of the universe exists in our now, simultaneous, in the contiguous now that we can detect, and that includes everything we're seeing through the Hubble telescope and all the way out to the furthest galaxies. And I'm not saying that if we look all the way out to the Big Bang, I'm not trying to say that we're not seeing through other nows. We may be, but as far as we can detect, in our universe is only a small portion of the actual material in the total universe, which means that there are at least 11 other dimensions, and probably a great deal more after that. So with that in mind, let's remember I said I was going to take you down the rabbit hole tonight. Okay, let's ask ourselves some questions. Does Pepe the Frog travel between dimensions? Is there a now where Hillary is president? Can people from Trump's now, which is the now we are in, visit or immigrate to Hillary's now? And does fake news originate in another now? And if so, how is it transmitted to this now? And do we have personal counterparts in other nows? How many nows can we live in simultaneously? Can we die in one now and be born or continue living in another? Can we develop an interdimensional internow internet? Oh boy, do we already have one? Do people from other nows influence us with mind control? If we go crazy in this now, can we be normal? Or are we normal in another now? Well, that's enough questions about nows for now. I told you we'd take you down the rabbit hole, so good magic, and we'll be back next week in whatever now your internet happens to be connected to. Good night.